So it's right on 7 o'clock now. So again, welcome to those people who have just joined us, and thank you for taking the time out this evening. A really important project. A couple of introductions just to start with. First myself, I'm Amon Martin, and I've been the project manager, project lead for this for about 2.5, almost 3 years. I've got a background in flood protection and engineering, and have been working in asset management, so looking after council's infrastructure and planning infrastructure. Alongside me at the council is Jamie Boyle, our coastal scientist. But the project's a lot bigger than us in council. We've got consultants, Royal Haskoning, supporting us. And in terms of people supporting us today, we've got John. Welcome, Sean.
Kia ora.
And thanks, Sean. And we've also got Connie. So throughout the presentation, the opportunity to ask questions, and Connie will be facilitating those questions. So if you type them into the chat, any questions, when we get a break, he'll ask them, and I'll hopefully be able to answer them, either me or the team. Also, we've got probably Rick Leafsting, but he was at an earlier meeting, representing or from Waikato Regional Council, and Alejandro as well. So if you guys are there, just say hello.
Kia ora koutou. Yes, Rick will probably join us shortly. He's finishing the other meeting.
Excellent. So I'm going to jump across to the slides now. So share my screen and run through our presentation. So firstly, the purpose, why are we here today? We want to ensure that there's an awareness of this project. And so we've gone and done some targeted letter drops. I think we've covered probably 8 areas around the district. There's an area in the lower part of Brophy's beach that we felt needed a bit more focused engagement to make sure there's an awareness of the project and to get feedback on what we might propose in the short or medium and long term. And that's the second part of it, for you guys to provide on what you think should be done. So there's a bit about the Shoreline Management Plan in terms of the overall project, how it's set up, who's involved, how we're running it. And then there's a little discussion on the specific hazard details at Brophy's, and of course, how to provide your feedback. So worth noting early on that the feedback that you put in the chat, we will review this and we'll take that on board. So if you have suggestions or thoughts as I'm presenting, happy for you to provide some feedback, and maybe you want more consultation, or you're prepared to accept more risk, things like that. Those are the type of feedback points we're looking for. So in terms of the project, why are we doing a shoreline management plan? You probably don't have to look too far from where you guys are to understand that coastal erosion is a challenge alongside inundation. So recently, I think within the last year, there's been challenges of that nature at Brophy's. But it's not just Brophy's, it's Whitianga and Thames Coast and right around the district. So the two hazards we are focusing on is the inundation or the flood risk and the erosion risk. How we're doing it is we're following a process set out by the Ministry for the Environment, and they suggest that we understand the hazards, understand what's happening first, and then move to what's important to the community. So the values, the objectives, what's at risk, and how to interpret risk. So having a hazard is one thing, but if it's a bare piece of land versus a school or a hospital or a road, that's another aspect of risk. And then we slowly move around to pathways and options. So the options aren't just options in terms of a set option. there's often a period of time where different options are appropriate, and so we need to change our approach and the options over time. Then we need to evaluate them and look at that timing a bit closer. What's an appropriate trigger? When should we start to do things? So that's the how we're doing it. In terms of the who, I think I mentioned the project team, but sitting under them or importantly feeding into them, working alongside them are coastal panels. So because the project is so big, 400 kilometres, we've had to break it up into 4 different areas. So there's 4 coastal panels. This area is the Mercury Bay Coastal Panel. That represents about 10 to 12 people from the community, quite varied backgrounds. So we look to get different perspectives on those panels, and it's those panels that we've gone through the hazard assessments in detail. We've looked at the risks. We've looked at all the various options, and we've started to develop these pathways with. So those panels are really important. In addition to the panels, the project team reports up to a governance committee. So that governance committee is made up of 4 councillors and 4 iwi reps. So Tony Fox in your area sits on that coastal governance committee, or Shoreline Management Plan Governance Committee. So does Sandra Gowdy and Terry Walker and Robin Sinclair. So those are the 4 reps from our council. So coastal panels will recommend these pathways, and then they'll be adopted eventually as we get community input and alter and change them. They'll get recommended to the governance committee that will adopt them. But the other aspect of this slide is just to highlight that we have done quite a lot of work on values. So we've had consultation events, probably 5 of them in each area. So that's probably 3 in Whitianga itself, 3 or 4, and you've got Cook's Beach and Mātarangi, and so we've been having a lot of consultation over the last 3 years, but we're really starting to get to the end of the project. So needing to do a bit more before we finalise the project. So one of the things that we focused on a year or so ago is what was important to the community. The nature and the environment was important, especially for the East Coast. The beaches were important, but also the access. So being able to get to your property, being able to drive around the coast. Which reminds me, a couple of key people involved in the project sitting alongside the technical team or within the technical team, as well as Waikato Regional Council. There's also Waka Kotahi. So they're pretty key in that discussion. So how are we doing the assessments? Firstly, we're looking at the flood inundation. So in this case, it's flood inundation, in some cases erosion. But it's not just the hazard or it's not just the hazard we look at. It's what's sitting behind the hazard. Is it a school? Is it a house? How high are the houses? How much are they exposed? How vulnerable they are? And that's what gives us an understanding of risk. So this, as way of an example, is Thames, and Thames has quite a lot of risk pretty much right now, and the blue areas are what's shown in potential for a flooding in a large event. So that is a very quick introduction to the project. I've mentioned it's a 3-year project. We've got 3 or 4 months to go. We're looking for feedback to change or make tweaks to our pathways and our recommendations, and all going well, we'll adopt a plan noting that there'll be significant work required for the implementation phase. So the adoption of the plan and the pathways won't be the end of the work. There will be more needing to be done. So the next part of what I talk about is specific to Brophy's Beach, but are there any questions, general questions on the Shoreline Management Plan project itself?
Kia ora koutou katoa. If you haven't used Teams before, the way that we're taking questions is just along the top bar of your screen. You'll see a little speech bubble with some lines in it. And if you click on that, that's going to bring up the chat down the side of your screen. And that's where you can place your questions. You'll see there's a couple there already. We are recording this session and we are also saving the chat down the side. So as Eamon is talking, if you have comments or feedback at that point, just pop it in there and it will be saved and entered into the project. And while we have Eamon here to answer your questions in this setting, that's where you place them and we'll get through all of them or as many of them as we can if a lot come in. So we do have a couple of questions, Eamon, to kick off with. And the first one is, why did the council not take action sooner? The foreshore was almost 50 metres from where it is today as opposed to 30 years ago. Inaction seems to be why we are where we are today.
Yeah, that's one I'm probably not able to answer in terms of why we didn't take action specifically at Brophy's Beach. Yeah, I've had conversations with previous mayors who thought that there would be action taken sooner at the time he was doing engineering works there. But yeah, I probably can't answer that one. So sorry about that. I kind of tripped myself up on the first one, but hopefully the next ones are. I would say that it's not just Brophy's Beach either. There are a lot of areas that have had erosion, and there's been, I guess, a desire to not interfere with the beaches and the nature, and so they have been often left alone, and erosion has kind of worked its way back. I don't know if there's, Sian, anything you wanted to kind of add to that question? Probably not possible, not knowing the TCDC perspective in terms of history.
Yeah, no, I'm sorry, I can't. I don't know why action's not happened in the past.
This person does have a second question, Eamon, that you'll be able to help with, and it will form sort of part of the presentation as we go through. In the letter for the invite tonight, it talks about inundation affected properties likely needing to be relocated. How will this work in practice?
So that's very much what we're here to talk about. We want to show you exactly what the risks are and see whether or not the pathway we're suggesting is the one that we need to follow, or there's another one, or feedback on that. So I'll answer that as we look at the pathway. So when we come probably 3 or 4 slides to go, I'll talk a bit more about that question. The short answer is there's a lot more work to be done in terms of understanding how that would happen, but the feedback we receive will help guide how that happens.
Thanks, Eamon. We do have one more question. What's the point of putting soil on top of the existing sandbags at Brophy's Beach to see it being washed away? It's a waste of time and resources. The beach needs urgent attention.
I think that's more of a comment. I'd say that's a desire to have some re-establishment of grass and recreation. I think a lot of cases the erosion protection is an ongoing effort required. So it's an ongoing, whether it's sand dunes or even the bags, it's ongoing maintenance when they get damaged, ongoing effort to plant grass and reinstate topsoil, so that they often are temporary in terms of the maintenance activities work for a certain period of time, and they're not a bulletproof solution. They need to be maintained on an ongoing basis. So I don't know if maybe some of that placing of soil is to rehabilitate and it hasn't worked, and whether it's done again and it might work the second time. Yeah, that's probably the answer to that one.
Thanks, Eamon. Just a final comment on the sandbag issue. Just asking how it is that a local property owner can build a seawall 20 odd years ago, and it's taken the council until now to action some sandbags which are ineffective. So in a similar vein.
Thanks for the comments. Yeah, the sandbags definitely have, and the erosion along that stretch have had a long history and lots of debate about what should and shouldn't be there and how effective they work, whether they should have been done a lot earlier. So definitely recognising that. But kind of what I think and wanted to draw people's attention to is the inundation risk. So although it's well known the erosion risk, often less talked about is the inundation risk. And so what you should be able to see on your screen is a map of Brophy's Beach, and a lot of the area is blue, and a lot of that means that there's a risk of inundation. So the other colours mean there's less risk, but the blue area means there's actually risk now. So I've put down a couple of questions that I need to answer to give it some context. So the first one is all of these assessments, or the assessments you see here, are 1% annual exceedance probability. So that means they're 1 in 100 year events. So that's quite a rare event in terms of it's in theory a storm or an event that doesn't happen for 100 years. It is very rare, and so that's what's shown in the blue. So you could expect that area to get wet in a really big event. Just how wet and how deep the water would be in some areas at the very edge of those lines, possibly the road itself. Only just getting wet with minimal depth. But if there was a place within the middle that is considerably lower, then even at the current risk of current storm, some of those places could have a reasonable amount of depth. So the second thing wanted to show is what is sea level rise, or what is the SLR, that's sea level rise. And so in terms of the legend, there's a number of scenarios, 0.2, 0.4. So the colour coding relates to those scenarios. So when you get 0.2 metres sea level rise and a 1 in 100 year event, the extent of the flooding pushes out slightly. In this case, it's only, in some cases, it pushes out a lot, and in Whitianga, it's relatively little flooding right now, and you need elements of sea level rise to push it out, and the extent gets quite big quite quickly with sea level rise. In this case, you're actually hitting up against some high ground. So even though the water level might go up 0.2, the extent isn't going further up. But the other thing to think about there is the area in blue actually gets 0.2 metres higher in terms of flood risk. So the water level in the blue area goes up the same amount relatively, or generally speaking, as the sea level rise. So not only does the depth in a 100-year event get deeper, there's also an increase of frequency of events that affect houses in those areas. So that's something I wasn't sure the specific or the community in this area was aware of. I'm almost certain everyone knows about the erosion and the sandbags, but as the coastal panel, so that's the people digesting this information, through our numerous consultation events, we haven't had a lot of specific feedback on the flooding risk relating to Brophy's Beach and what possibly we should do about the Brophy's Beach inundation risk. So that's a big part of why we're here, to hear what you think about that. So hopefully that gives some context. The next slide is just to explain that's uncertainty relating to sea level rise. In the short term, you can expect a bit of certainty, so you could expect 0.2. This is showing out to 2040. and it becomes a bit of a range when you get further out. So when you get to 2060, could be up to 0.5, but may only be 0.3. So that's kind of how sea level rise is tracking. When you get out to 100 years, it could be up to 1.4 meters, but it potentially could be quite low as well. When I say low, 0.6. So those are the projections. There is uncertainty with those. The projections change. So there's these new projections, and as recently as the last couple of months, I think a new set of graphs came out. They didn't look any better than these, similar, but not any better, not alleviating any concerns about the sea level rise predictions. So just thinking back to what the map shows, I guess it's not necessarily the extent, but over time, those sea level rise increases will impact Brophy's Beach quite significantly, because the area is already inundated and will get greater depths potentially of inundation in a big event. So the next slide is about the pathways, and so I'll explain that in detail. But just before that, do people have questions around the hazard assessment and the information I've provided on that sea level rise and flood inundation?
We do have a number of questions, Eamon, that we can go through now. To those people who have joined after the beginning of the meeting, we're using the chat thread to take your questions, and Eamon will be able to answer them at various points throughout his presentation. The chat thread will also be saved and used to provide feedback into the project. So if you just have a comment rather than a question, feel free to leave that in the chat thread as well, and we'll get through as many questions as we can. The first question, Eamon, is, are you identifying where new public spaces will be established that won't be threatened by erosion? Maybe the places where houses are relocated due to flood risk can become public open space.
In some cases, we have actually a lot of. I think we haven't gone into the detail at this stage about what areas would be new public space. But in some cases, we've highlighted that allowing space for nature is appropriate. So there could be an example, maybe Rhodes Park is a good example. If you're aware of Thames, the lower parts of Rhodes Park are going to get wetter and wetter. There's also a Ramsar or significant natural features along the Thames coast. So allowing space for nature is considered an appropriate recommendation there. But we probably haven't gone very far in terms of recommending open spaces with the project. So that would be something to be more specific on. At the moment, we're just tagging some areas to allow space for nature.
Thanks very much. We've got a couple of questions around the hazard assessments, and I might give them to you both at the same time because they're along similar lines. The first one is, how relevant is the 100-year event mapping today and in the future, seeing as 100-year events occur much more frequently now? And the other question is, how accurate are these predictions and what degree of volatility are there with your timelines?
So the first one, I'd probably acknowledge that is correct. Over time, the 100-year event won't be the 100-year event. So that what's happening now in a 100-year event may start happening every 20 years. So it will no longer be the 100-year event. We consider what we're showing now, though, as the 100-year event today. So valid and relevant for right now. And we've also looked at other events. So there's a level of detail which we've presented to the coastal panels that shows when basically with a certain amount of sea level rise, you will actually get 100-year event happening every 20 years. So it effectively becomes a 20-year event. So definitely pick up your point that the hazards are becoming worse over time, but also acknowledge we're aware of that and have incorporated it into the information we've used to provide these pathways. What was this? That was the first one. What was the second one again, Connie?
Just how accurate are these predictions? What degree of volatility is there with timelines?
There's probably two aspects of volatility. The one that I've talked about a little bit and relates to time the most is the sea level rise. So a range of scenarios there. The other one just is really how accurate have we been in terms of predicting what a 100-year event is. And some of the better ways of ensuring accuracy is to calibrate against real scenarios. And so the event last year came out fairly close and calibrated quite well to what our hazard assessments were saying. So I can't, off the top of my head, tell you the exact numbers, but the 20-year event, whether it was a 20-year event, we were able to look up what our modelling showed, and the 20-year event matched very closely with the 20-year event or the real event scenario that occurred last year. Happy to prompt more detail on that if Sian's got that, and or if people want to know a bit more about that assessment process.
Sian, did you want to jump in at all?
I only say that that's pretty much correct, Eamon. We definitely used the May 2021 storm data to validate our model. I think it was actually slightly below a 1 in 20-year event. But that's, the point is it equated to the modelling results, or we validated the modelling results and calibrated them based on it.
I would probably put in or note one area that we could do more work on, and that is the interaction of rivers. So the project is a shoreline management project and looked predominantly at coastal inundation. So if there was a river event that coincided, the flooding could actually be slightly greater. There's a few things to think about, like statistically getting a 100-year river event and a 100-year coastal event is very, very, very unlikely, but there could be for this area a little bit more hazard than we're showing because of the river aspect hasn't been incorporated fully. So worth noting that.
Thanks very much, Eamon. We just have one final comment at this point, which is that councils should allow consents without fees, so landowners can raise their dwellings, especially considering there's been inaction on council's part till now.
Yeah, I think I've heard that a couple of times, and I support that approach. If there was the ability to raise properties and remove them from the risk, then that sounds like a sensible suggestion, and something, if it was the consenting costs that we were able to pick up, something that would be a win-win, I think. So I wanted to keep focusing on the flooding aspect, and then afterwards I'll come back to the erosion and talk about erosion. And so we've looked at this extent of flooding, and there are a few houses or a reasonable amount of houses here, but at this stage we haven't tagged this for protection. So we haven't looked at in any detail of what it would take to protect these houses, how much it would cost, and who would pay. What we have been saying, and it's been quite consistent, is normally the beneficiaries of any flood protection would pay. So in terms of providing some kind of fund or some kind of protection here, from an engineering point of view, I believe it would be possible. Having walked along the stream edge, there's a bit of room in most cases, but there's also a challenge in terms of there would not be that many households who would need to contribute or pay for that protection if the protection was going to fall, which it probably would with the beneficiaries of that protection. So at this stage, we haven't said protect, which leads us to quite a kind of general comment that planning practices to reinstate development and plan for retreat in hazard-affected areas. So one of those things just suggested now could be that we support the raising of floor levels through making consenting processes easier in this area. So that is a valid suggestion. But also worth noting is we think there may be a little bit of time in terms of what is acceptable in terms of risk. So some of the houses probably already have elevated floor levels. Some of the lower levels appear to be garages and maybe more resilient to water getting it inside them. So what we've said is when it gets to an event where it happens every 20 years, that's what 5% AEP means, and there's more than 500 half a metre of flood depth, we don't think that's going to be viable to be in those locations without something happening. And so what needs to happen prior to that? Well, firstly, before I mention that, the time period for that is the sea level rise required for that is 0.6 metres. What that means in terms of the time period is actually 57 years. So there is a risk now as a coastal panel and technical group. We think that 2 people there for the short, medium term, but when it gets to 0.6, something will have needed to happen, and it could be raising of floor levels, zoning to ensure there's only development that's up above the floor levels, or not included here, but we could look at some kind of protection to buy time. And so I'll pause there, and then I'll talk about the erosion aspect and the road, which is also in this pathway. But anything already there, Connie?
We don't have any further questions on that material, Eamon. Just a further question around why action's only being contemplated now, specifically in relation to protection of the road.
So I suppose one thing, and it probably goes back to that first comment about things not being done earlier in terms of Brophy's speech. So there hasn't been a full assessment across the district of all the challenges and the ability to prioritise what's most important. So things have happened, but only and best decisions have been made with an understanding of what's in front of people. So when there's an event, often there'll be an approach to respond to that event, but actually stepping back and understanding how these events are going to change over time and how the whole district, how big the whole district's challenge is and what the priorities are, that work hasn't been done before. So that is one of the real benefits of the project, is having that much wider perspective, both in terms of time and in terms of the whole district, to support decision making better. And so the question about the road, I think there's two parts to that. So I'll come on to the road now. So we've got, just stepping through the pathways. So we've got raising floor levels where necessary in areas affected by inundation. We've covered that. That very much relates to the flooding aspect. But we've also got improved existing coastal defences, and that is really the sandbags to a large extent. So making sure that the sandbags do their job and prevent land, and specifically the road, being washed away or being compromised, but also raising and providing further protection to the state highway. So even though the sandbags are doing an adequate job at the moment for coastal erosion, and they probably will, if they're maintained and when they're damaged, they can be repaired, they will for the long term, they won't provide flood protection to an acceptable level for the road. Probably now, the road gets flooded every now and again, and from a community perspective, we think that's acceptable. If the road is closed for several hours a year in a big tide event, we think that's acceptable. But when that happens frequently, high tides or every year for long periods, we think that's the point the road needs to be raised. So in terms of the road, we're advocating here the erosion protection is really important, but also the need to, at some point in the future, possibly out to 0.4 or 0.6 metres, raise the road as well. So I'll kind of mention my perspective on the road raising. Raising the road would provide some protection to the houses from inundation directly from the coast. I don't think, or I don't know whether it would provide the required level of protection. And the reason I say that is the road level of service may not be as high as the protection that the houses want. So a level of service protected to a 10-year event or a 20-year event might be acceptable for a road, but really the houses might be saying we want 50 or 100-year protection. So that could be a little bit of a challenge long term, because there may be a difference in protection, and therefore it's actually the houses that might benefit from that additional height of the road rather than the road itself. And then secondly, the inundation would come around the back through the bridge, so some other protection would be needed there. So at the moment, we're not advocating for protection in terms of we, the coastal panel, and the technical team, but it is something that could be considered if we get a lot of feedback on it.
We do just have one more comment and question relating to that, Eamon. This person says, I feel the erosion prevention efforts and the inundation risks can be related. Why can't the level of the sandbags and soil added not be raised each time along Brophy's, or even the green reserve area be raised to prevent the sea coming over and flooding the low-lying area? I agree with the previous person that it's a total waste of ratepayer dollars to just keep maintaining the status quo. The current sandbags are not adequate and the road is often compromised.
I think it can be, and that's good feedback to hear. If there's a desire to increase the sandbags, probably what we're saying here is we should do that, but we don't need to do it for quite a long period of time. So in terms of protecting the road from flooding, we're saying, and if you think it should happen faster, we're saying the road does get flooded. It got flooded a year or so ago, but it's not flooded often. and not for very long. Therefore, we don't need to do protection or flooding of the road until we start to see quite a bit of sea level rise happening.
Thanks very much. The person finished their comment as you were speaking to say that in their opinion it's better to have better protection than none. And then a question, why can't the sandbags be replaced by a permanent wall like in Dunedin or the other end of Buffalo Beach Road?
So there could be options around rocks. My understanding, I don't think do we have Jamie here tonight? But
we do, yep.
So my understanding that there is a desire to keep that the sandbags are more natural than walls or rocks, and therefore one of the desires of the wider community and probably residents is to try and keep that looking more natural, so having more of a natural beach. But I'll hand over to our coastal scientist for a bit more comment.
Yeah, I mean, I wasn't here during the consent process, which was something like 7 or 8 years ago. But as far as I'm aware, the reason those sandbags went in was to sort of mimic the natural environment a bit better than a rock wall.
We've got no further questions or comments at the moment, Amon, thanks.
Okay, I probably would highlight that the erosion lines we're showing at the bottom is what we would anticipate happening if we didn't maintain the erosion protection, so that it would eventually eat away through the road. And so that's really why we're saying it's important that those some form of erosion protection is maintained and stays there, because that's an important link through to Atunu and the rest of the Coromandel North. We did give very brief consideration of alternative routes. I mean, there's the 309 road, but none of them, no options really seemed viable. Protecting that road was considered pretty important. So hopefully we've raised awareness and you understand what the hazards are, and you have provided feedback on what you've heard. The last part is a bit more opportunity on how to provide feedback. So you've used the chat. Any information you think of after this, you can email through to tcdc.govt, or our coast at tcdc.govt.nz. So that's the email address there. And I'll quickly take you to our website, which has a lot of information. So that's the TCDC one you can see in blue.govt.nz. And so hopefully this works for me. So that brings up our shoreline management plan page. Information here about at the top, because it's most current, is the meetings and online events. So we've done a few already last week, and we've got Whangamata and Pauanui coming up. But there's also a feedback tool, which I'll ask Sian to very quickly show you, but just a bit more about what's on here. All those pathways you can see, you can download them for any area. So the Mercury Bay one, you can download all the Mercury Bay ones by pushing this button here, so that will show you Brophy's Beach, but also Whitianga and other areas. So that's very useful. And then coming down here, if you really want to get into the detail about flood events, then you want to find the 20-year event and the King Tide event and other events. Then go past it. Here it is here. Important additional resources. So like someone mentioned, that the 100-year event might not be a 100-year event in the future. It might actually be a 20-year event. And so by looking at the 20-year event and looking at the sea level increments, you can actually get a feel for when that's going to happen, whether it's in 0.2 sea level rise, 0.4, when you're starting to see that 100-year event become a 20-year event. And then the other thing that can be concerning in some areas, you actually get king tide events. So a king tide event, so an event that happens kind of every 6 or so times a year, will sometimes become what's known as a 20-year event. So that's the information that is sitting behind some of our thinking. We're not presenting it all because it is a little bit complex in terms of a whole lot of different scenarios, but that's where you can find that by clicking on that. And then quickly, there's a little video that kind of highlights our engagement we've done across the district, but in terms of providing feedback, it's quite close to the top, just by clicking on this tool here, and I will hand over to Sian to give a bit of a demo.
Thanks, Amon. So if you click on the button that Amon was showing you, it will take you to this homepage here, and it's the, as it says, the community consultation tool. It provides you with some background information to the project, some sort of prompting questions in terms of what we want to hear from you and whether you support the pathways or not, and how to provide feedback. And it tells you how it works and how to leave a comment. But the key to all of this is click on the map. It just repeats the instructions about how to leave a comment. You accept that, and it takes you to a map of the Coromandel. Then it allows you to select the specific stretch of coastline that you're particularly interested in. You click on that stretch of the coast, and it takes you to it. And I'll just go to my next screen here. And so I've zoomed in, obviously, on Whitianga, Buffalo Beach, Brophies, and so on. And this particular policy unit is the Buffalo Beach Reserve here. So I've clicked on that section of coast, and it brings up that poster. If you click on that again, it then takes you to that in more detail. So you can see here that's that Buffalo Beach Reserve area and what the proposals are for that location. Then if you actually want to leave a comment, it's as simple as, and you can see people have left comments, it's as simple as clicking on the add comment button, then add a new feature. It gives you the arrow. You can put that arrow wherever you want, and then you type your comment, click return, and then it's stored in the system as these other comments you can see here are. And then Amon, while I've got the floor, we were asked early on about what retreat means in practice, and I think you said you were going to come back to that, and I'm not sure we've covered that quite yet.
Sure. Thanks for the reminder, Sian. So 142 policy units means a whole lot of different circumstances and different drivers and different risk levels all across the district. So we haven't done the work to say exactly what managed retreat will be for every policy unit, and we acknowledge it will be different. And so managed retreat or planned retreat we're talking about now is a range of things. The first kind of level is undertaking the work and informing the community. So that's a little bit about what we've done now. So when the community has the information, they're able to make decisions about whether they live in certain places, whether they actually build or rebuild following an event. And so providing that information to people as early as possible and anticipating what things will look like long term. So that's the first kind of step. Alongside some of those things, or that first step, actual events will occur. People may be influenced by flooding events on what they do. Raising floor levels might be something that happens. Insurance could be a factor that also causes people to think about what they do and what they want to do in those areas. Then next we can encourage people through not mandatory but voluntary purchase of properties. So that could be appropriate in some areas, and it has been in lots of places across the world. In the UK, a few in New Zealand, not all successful, especially when you go a step further and you're looking at enforcing managed retreat. So that's not something we're advocating for in terms of the range. That's the extreme end of what managed retreat might look like. Probably another thing in the middle, or a couple of things in the middle, is having planning or rules that ensure resilient development. So perhaps the floor levels have to be at a certain height. So if you're in a flood level, you may have to build up your land yourself, or build on poles. That could be something you think about. And then another one we've talked about, but by no means is a policy, is leases. So alongside purchasing properties, there could be an option to lease back the land and the property, so people know, and in this case, there'd be potentially 60 or so years worth of viable, habitable space until there was significant events that caused a change in approach. And so that 60 years might be enough time for a lot of people to be comfortable with having some assurance, not insurance, but that they could live there, but at the end of the 60 years, the house or the property would need to be relocated. So the answer is we don't know exactly what it means for every area, and almost all those things are possible for a whole lot of different areas. So hopefully that's covered that. Any more questions for me, Connie?
I don't have any more questions, but we do have a couple of minutes remaining if anyone wanted to jump in the chat and just make the most of the fact that we've got Eamon here right now to answer your questions. We do have somebody just saying thanks, Eamon. It's an emotive topic, they say, when people's properties are on the line. So just thanking you for your time. And the other thing I would say is that Sian has taken us through the feedback tool. If for any reason you are struggling to use that, or you're not quite sure how to use it, even though the instructions are all there, we do have an email address, and you're welcome to just send us an email with your thoughts based on what you've looked at online or what we've talked about tonight. Jamie has put that email address in the chat thread for you, but it is ourcoast@tcdc.govt.nz. This recording of tonight's meeting will also be online on our Shoreline management page, and I'll put that address in the chat thread as well for you if anyone wanted to watch the meeting again.
Thank you, Connie. And I'd just kind of highlight that we'll be taking this feedback from tonight and over the next few weeks back to our coastal panels. And so we'll take the feedback and look at those pathways, see what we need to add or change to the pathways. And that's how we'll get an almost final version of the pathways that will go out to some hopefully in-person meetings. So probably in Whitianga will be the closest one for you guys. And then we can discuss those in person before they get taken to the governance for sign off or adoption. So that whole next phase is probably 3 or 4 months in terms of getting feedback, making changes, coming back out to present on final pathways. So thanks.
Quick question on that. Sorry, Eamon, just a quick question on that feedback process. Somebody's just asking whether the feedback that you take to the panels is shared anywhere.
Yes, it is. In terms of a bit of an oversight, in that website I showed, there are also meeting minutes. So I'll just see if I can find it quickly. Basically, I think it's under here. So when you start to drill down into the coastal panels, there's actually meeting minutes in here. And so a lot of information's captured on individual discussions about policy units and what should and shouldn't change, and how that feedback has been presented to the coastal panels as well. So yes is the answer. You can find it here, but it's probably, you do need to be looking. It doesn't jump out at you in terms of the feedback. Anything, I know last time our open meetings, we actually developed individual posters that had the feedback on each policy unit. And so we presented that, or we provided that to the coastal panels so that they could work through all the feedback step by step. So that the short answer is yes. If there's a desire to make that more available, we could probably do that if you want to add that in the comment if that's what you want to see. Any last comments?
That's all the comments and questions we have at the moment. Thanks, Eamon.
Thank you very much, everyone, for your time. I do acknowledge, I mean, we've done a lot of these, but it is a motive thing for individuals who are impacted by future either now or in the long term. So we do see the project as a way of either preparing for or limiting the effects of what will happen. So at least people are informed and can make decisions about it rather than it happening all at once. And in this case, there's probably a wee bit of sea level rise required before the risks become extreme. But thank you, everyone, for your attendance and feedback. And probably, hopefully, COVID restrictions allow, I'll be doing something in person in the next couple of months and might meet a few of you in person. So thank you very much and good night.